meaning that goes hand in hand with health, safety, dignity, opportunity. And that is really the basis. Housing is fundamental to ensuring that individuals and households and communities can thrive and can make the best of the opportunities that cities and human settlements have to offer. However, we are not making enough progress on advancing the right to adequate housing. We have seen this in the SDG reports. We are seeing this in all the data, all the numbers. Housing, the failure to advance enough on the right to adequate housing is seen by many as a crisis. I see it as a structural failure of our systems to deliver on the most fundamental promise to humanity. And that is why this discussion is very, very important today. At this assembly, and some of you may have already heard about this, several member states, including several who are around this table, have tabled, co-sponsored and tabled a resolution on adequate housing for all. And this is quite important. The rights framework for adequate housing exists, but there is a need for a stronger and more inclusive multilateral platform to operationalize it and to fully exploit its potential. This mechanism will allow us to share experiences, to provide and to engage in mutually supportive activities, and to bring a wide range of stakeholders together, led by governmental strategic frameworks, but not only. Housing has been placed as at the center of a renewed social contract, new social contract by our Secretary General, and we take this task and this responsibility as the UN agency responsible for adequate housing very, very seriously. So today's session, very quickly, has two objectives. First, we want to showcase how adequate housing is central to socioeconomic development and to environmental sustainability and to addressing the big questions of our time. By adopting comprehensive approaches, we can unlock a range of benefits that particularly focus on lifting up low-income, marginalized, excluded, and vulnerable communities, ultimately benefiting everyone, because that is the promise of leaving no one and no place behind. We will also look at how policies can be coordinated, how stakeholders can come together, and we'll hear experiences from different countries on this. But then the second objective is to go beyond this moment of experience sharing, to explore and discuss how to develop a multilateral mechanism for advancing evidence-based structural solutions to the housing challenges that we all face. And it's not a challenge that is specific to the developing world or the global south. Housing is a challenge that manifests maybe in different ways, but manifests absolutely everywhere. From the extreme manifestations of lack of adequate housing, such as slums and homelessness, to unfit dwellings, to not enough, to overcrowding. There are different manifestations of the absence of adequate housing, and we want to understand how this multilateral platform can help us advance this agenda together. How can we have better data collection? How can we have better benchmarking? How can we measure success? How can we report success? This is fundamental. Today's session is only the beginning, as I was just saying to the minister here today. We hope to take this conversation forward through to the high-level political forum in New York, through to the SDG summit also in New York in September, and through eventually to the Summit of the Future, which will be held in 2024, next year in September. So welcome to the conversation. Please join in. Please bring in your partners, your experiences, your knowledge to this conversation, and we hope to have each and every one of you in this journey with us as we go forward. Let me now invite our keynote speaker, Professor Ricky Burdett, from the London School of Economics, from the Council of Urban Initiatives. Professor Burdett is not a stranger to anybody who has been working on housing or urban development, and he will have about 10 minutes to give us some framing for the discussion today. Please, the floor is yours. Works.
Okay, is that any better? Yes. Okay, right. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. If there's one line, I guess, I would like all of you to remember is that housing is so important that it must not be seen alone. Housing is part of making cities, and everyone in the room here knows that, and I think the discussion today is very much a part of how to make inclusive and integrated housing and how that has to be seen as part of a much broader discussion of cities. As has already been mentioned, I represent not only the London School of Economics, but also a group which is 3 organizations. You can see them under there. It's UN Habitat, it's my group at the LSE, and it's the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose run by Mariana Mazzucato, who will be giving you also one of the keynotes tomorrow. So this is a sort of story in 2 parts about cities. The Council of Urban Initiatives is a group of mayors, of thinkers, doers in many senses from around the world who are interested in making cities more just, more green and more healthy. But just that word, cities, it's worth reminding ourselves, are not always the same. You all represent cities from different parts of the world. This map, probably you're on it, shows the number of people moving into each city or being born in each of these cities per hour. So every second, every minute that I speak, someone in your city or one of the cities there has actually moved into. The pressures of growth are enormous. Therefore, even the question about housing, the chair already alluded to this. It's not just a global south problem. It's also about dealing with global north, retrofitting and all that. And I think the nature of that housing, how you engage in it, how you retrofit it, I think just as important as building new things, is as important in Bogota, in Freetown, even in Barcelona, where the mayor is viciously fighting for a new housing policy in a city that has, set the standard around the world for some time. Whether it's in India, in Mumbai, and I'll show 1 or 2 examples, or even in my city, London, at the top end, let's go to the scale, in terms of unaffordability. There are attempts to sort of deal with that issue. And of course, Singapore, which I'll talk about in a second, is important to dwell on. I mentioned that the Council of Urban Initiatives is co-chaired by Mariana Mazzucato, an economist, who tomorrow will talk about how important it is to shift the debate. I think everyone here and in the room understands that. We've been talking about housing for many, many years. What do we need to do that is different? And her argument with Liliane Farah is that we need to refocus the discussion around missions, around making housing a mission, and it has to be human rights approach. I mean, her main argument, really, you'll hear it tomorrow much more forcefully than I can put it, is that the creation of value at the center of a common good approach is reshaping the market that makes housing. My argument today is really that we need to reshape cities at the same time. These are not separate arguments. We are not going to go through this, don't worry, but this is the message that I want to give. But most importantly of all, I think for this debate, in terms of multilateral engagement, governance matters. Who decides to build housing? Which level of national government, state government if it exists, city government? These are 2 examples, interesting. The Indian system and the Colombian system in South America have completely different levels of engagement in terms of blue, the central government, or green, the local level of community, which in fact in some Indian cities are actually not involved in the provision of housing. So these questions of who decides and what is built is fundamental. So with our council, we've been studying a number of examples. These will all be published in the next weeks or so. But what is so interesting is that the housing question is a big question. It's a question of human rights, sort of belief systems that our society or these institutions really stand for, but also it's quite micro. What do you do with a building? What's it like actually living in a place? So inclusion is also about making spaces accessible. And Barcelona has been very powerful, A, at setting this agenda which reduces evictions, provides housing for those who can't afford it, but also creating new buildings, and you see it on the right, for people who have not had access to housing can live together. And shared resources is just as important a part of housing, not just the bedroom, but also how do you live together and how do you make society and community, I think, is central. We've learned a lot over the years from various mayors in Bogota, most recently Claudia Lopez, again a member of the Council of Urban Initiatives, of how to deal with tens of thousands of units that have been built badly for people at the bottom end of the scale. What do you do with it? Do you knock it down and start again? Of course not. You can't do that anymore, and it's not irresponsible from the point of view of climate change, of course. And therefore, there's a very strong program of retrofitting not just the buildings, but the spaces in between the buildings. Because I think one of the arguments I would want you to keep, in a way, today is that it's the housing unit is as important as the space in a way in front of it, where people come together, whether it's elderly or younger people or people who are disadvantaged. Interestingly, in Melbourne, one of the fastest growing cities, in fact, in Australia, but sprawling like mad. I hope there's no one here from Melbourne. I don't want to offend you, but you know, it's not good news and it's all car dependent. So there are initiatives about co-living where private sector have got together and actually enabled new forms of co-living where there are shared spaces, which means what? That people do want to live in central areas and not in suburbia. These are totally about the issues that UN Habitat is pushing around multilateralism and sort of multi-stakeholder arguments. I want to show two examples in the last minutes that I have in talking about this initiative. How nice to see you. Lovely to see you. We've been plotting together for some time. And the two projects I want to show you are one in Mumbai and the other in Singapore. Now, the one in Mumbai, which I'm going to show you, started many years ago, in fact, in the 70s and 80s, when the provision, of course, of housing, particularly in that city, was very, very severe, and of course it still is in many ways. And it's an initiative that was funded by the World Bank and then delivered by one of the housing agencies. Now, many of you will recognize this sort of picture. This was another project, it's not the one I'm going to show you, where large amounts of money, I mean hundreds of millions of dollars, were spent on the sort of social housing that you see on the left-hand side. In a few months after occupation, it became a vertical slum. I don't have time to go into that. But the key point I'm making here, and this is where with the executive director of UN Habitat, we've talked about this, design matters. You can create slums overnight. You can create ghettos. So you don't actually solve the sort of housing problem just by providing a roof. The project, which is called Charkop, is a large area. Nearly 180,000 people actually live there. And these are pictures of what it's like now, 15, 20 years. Now, many of you are saying, why is this guy from the LSE showing us pictures of rather messy cities? Because that's where we want to live. That's where we want to be. We want to be in housing where you have shops nearby, where you have access to jobs, and much more. And what was interesting about this project, I say, started nearly 25 years ago with World Bank investment. It was designed to be adaptable. This is something I think we've forgotten in our sort of commissioning or briefing about projects. Not enough time to go into it in detail, but if you just look at this plan, you can see that the project was designed to have larger units and smaller units for richer people and poorer people next to each other around a courtyard. It's that simple, but also to have schools, to have playgrounds, to have places of worship right next to where people live. So this is, I think, a sort of an ideology. I know the chair may say, well, we've heard about this before, but we forget about it when we come to actually making the decision. So this simple idea of having a courtyard means that women, men, mothers, and children can actually be together. The second key point of this project, again, I think a lesson for all of us to learn, is the adaptability. Housing does not remain the same. You don't put someone in a box and keep them there forever. People have needs and differences, and here we are, a little bit messy, but what does it mean? That the units that you see here were designed to be extended, amplified, to have shops below, to have tailors and others right in the middle where people live. Therefore, the creation of a genuine piece of city, Chair, is what I think is important. The final project I want to show is in Singapore. Now, you might say Singapore has a model which is unbeatable or irrepeatable. Why not? Why couldn't it be? Why shouldn't this discussion, exactly the agenda that is being set by UN Habitat, not be replicated in the countries that are represented here? Again, something that has been happening for at least 20, 30 years. In the case of Singapore, you can see the area I'm talking about up in the red top sort of square. It's an enormous part of the city which has been planned for generations. You all know that Singapore has something like 80% of its housing actually a form of public housing. That's because of a whole series of relatively rich and complex forms of also financial provision through the Central Provident Fund. But just in terms of design, without public access to public transport, housing doesn't work. You create isolated ghettos way out on the edges of the city, with commuters, say, in some of the cities represented here, spending 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon to get to work. That's a form of exclusion which housing itself needs to address. So this project has, as you can see, with the M's spelt out where public transport is. There's an integration of nature, both in terms of green but also in terms of water. And each project, each part of this enormous site is actually thought about at different scales. The scale of what's it like in your front door? What's it like in the garden for children or teenagers, or most importantly, in the case of Singapore, where people are getting older and living longer and well, for people of a certain generation. There's an integration between transport and activities. These are right in the middle of the housing projects. It's not a shopping center somewhere else, and it's designed in that way. I don't think there's anyone in the room here who couldn't be thinking about projects which deal with elderly people. Here we see an elderly people facility on the bottom left. And I want to end, if I have 1.5 more minutes, with the London example. It's not just a problem around the world. We, in 2012, had an Olympic Games. I was quite involved as working with the mayor and with the Prime Minister at the time. And the idea was very simple. Why am I showing it to you? Because it brings together the discussion about housing and inclusion probably more strongly than others. This is a map that you don't need to focus on, but in red, it shows you where the most deprived people of London are. And we do have very deprived people in London. We're talking about unemployment, loss of education, pregnant teenagers, etc. So the decision was to spend $15 billion of public money there. And as a result of that, there's now housing of which 48% is affordable. It's an approach towards adequate design to create inclusive and integrated housing. There are many ways to actually measure that. You were saying, Chair, before, how does one actually process and understand what is being done? And I think all of that is to be shared and is available on our website of the Council on Urban Initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Burdett, and thank you for flagging that shaping cities is as important as shaping the market. I think I take that away. And the fact that you focused on building cities for all, and the question of governance, who decides and for whom. I think those are big questions. On that note, we now have 2 ministerial interventions. It's my pleasure to welcome our Executive Director, Madam Maimouna Mohamed Sharif, but she has graciously said that she would like to speak after the ministers, so she wants to hear what you have to say before she speaks. So it is my pleasure now to give the floor to the Minister of Housing and Urban Planning of Bahrain, Your Excellency, Madam Amna bint Ahmed Al Rumaihi. Minister, you are also an economist, so you will tell us a little bit about how we can advance housing policies to shape inclusive and prosperous communities. What is the experience of Bahrain in this regard?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Your Excellency, Madam Maimouna Mohamed Sharif, the Executive Director of the United Nations Human Settlement Program, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Housing is a key factor of our welfare system in the Kingdom of Bahrain. A quick background. We have started the housing development program since the 60s, and this reflects the early awareness of the Kingdom of the importance of such services towards stability and security of the communities. Upon the direction of His Majesty the King in 2013 to deliver 40,000 units to citizens, Bahrain started building 5 new sustainable towns in various governorates in the Kingdom of Bahrain, with modern, inclusive, and sustainable urban planning design with complete quality of life components, which includes waterfront and public beaches, and as well as providing lanes dedicated to walking and cycling, as well as open spaces and green spaces, and other services such as health, education, and commercial facilities. Almost all of us shared the same challenge with rapid increase of population and the association needs for urban communities, and the resources challenges that comes with it, be it the availability of lands or government budgets. The key solution to overcome this issue is by expanding our relationship with the private sector and making them part of the solution. Bearing that in mind, we had to think outside the box in order to meet the expectations of our people. So we put a strategy that contains 3 pillars. Pillar number 1, innovative and immediate solution through unique financial schemes. We have launched a new financing scheme to give citizens more options to accelerate the pace of having their home, which have enhanced the Kingdom's long-term sustainable development. The Kingdom allocated the biggest budget toward the housing agenda in Bahrain's history, around $1.6 billion, in association with the private sector for the years 2023 and 2024. We have doubled the minimum financing amount from $55,000 to $106,000, and the maximum financing amount from $159,000 to $186,000. Pillar number 2, Government Land Development Program, which was launched in 2019. It represents an opportunity to strengthen an effective relationship between the government and the private sector through the participation of real estate developer companies in the implementation of housing units, which will be directed to the citizen benefiting from the financing scheme at a prices close to the value of the fund. This diversification in housing services is aimed at handling the ever-growing demand on steady increase of the population rate. Pillar number 3, continue to build modern and sustainable housing towns. Bahrain is one of the pioneering countries in the region to establish 8 sustainable housing cities in the various governorates in the kingdom, participating in the international community by implementing the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, especially Goal 11. The ministry will continue to build modern, typical, and sustainable housing towns that feature modern architectural design and provide modern facilities and serve to cater the health, education, and social need as self-contained communities. As a national agency, the ministry works closely with other local and regional stakeholders to achieve its objectives, namely Scan Bank, other local commercial banks, real estate developers, other government regulatory body, and civil society organization. Moreover, we conduct annual GCC ministers' meetings to discuss laws, strategies, and exchange experience and unify policies and regulations. Besides that, Bahrain and UN co-signed the Strategic and Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework 2021 and 2022 in March 2021 to work together to achieve Bahrain's national vision, a society where justice, security, stability, and prosperity prevail. The Ministry and UN Habitat also joined effort to develop and launch important reports such as Housing Profile 2012, National Housing Policy in 2019, and Bahrain National Report achieved progress in implementation the New Urban Agenda 2021. This all focusing on SDG 11. On top of this, we are proud to join forces with Kenya, France, Jordan, and Malaysia to draft a resolution on adequate housing for all, to make sure leaving no one behind. Last but not least, efforts continue to formulate innovative and immediate solutions to accelerate the achievement pace to provide adequate and affordable housing services to all citizens. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for sharing your approach, as well as for flagging the strong and long-standing partnership between UN Habitat and the Kingdom of Bahrain, which we hope will go from strength to strength, also following our resolution on housing and its implementation. Thank you very much. May I now invite Mr. Henry Yap, the Undersecretary of the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development in the Philippines. Undersecretary, you will talk to us a little bit about how you're ensuring inclusive, affordable, and adequate housing for all through land planning and pro-poor policies. Please, the floor is yours.
Honorable Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The Philippines is one of the members of the United Nations Habitat Assembly, is one in commitments promoting adequate and affordable housing, inclusive human settlements, and well-planned communities for all. We acknowledge that housing is not only a basic right, but an important basis for stability and security for us individuals and for our families. We recognize the transformative power of housing in empowering and inspiring our individuals to better themselves and to contribute to our communities. As such, the Philippines has declared housing as among its flagship program of the current administration. Recently, we have adopted what we call the Pambansang Pabahay para sa Filipino program, or the National Housing Program for Filipinos. We target to make housing affordable and available to all, to make a significant reduction in our housing deficit, and to eradicate informal settlements in our cities. This program, while new, addresses the same issues that previous governments tried to address, including access to financing and housing units delivery. Today, given the limited housing budget allocation, we are looking towards accessing financing through engaging both government and private sector financial institutions to fund and develop housing in our new settlements. Moreover, we're looking at the development of affordable housing units by leveraging on idle government lands, utilizing innovative housing construction technologies, and providing interest support to the poor. In addition, we look forward to integrating settlements by developing vertical housing in highly urbanized areas, developing strategic locations within urban centers, complete with basic utilities and services and opportunities for livelihood and employment. We also are pushing for in-city resettlement for our informal settlers by transforming slums and blighted areas through urban renewal projects, programs, and mixed-use development. And lastly, we are making sure that we can include in the empowerment of our local governments, whose main responsibility is towards developing participatory or community-led housing projects and settlements. The Philippines is committed to implementing all these policies and strategies embodied in our new Philippine Urban Agenda through a whole-of-nation approach in line with our vision for a building better, greener, and smarter cities in an inclusive Philippines by 2040. In support of the implementation of the Philippine New Urban Agenda, we have prepared the National Housing and Urban Development Sector Plan, a 20-year roadmap for the housing and urban development sector to ensure the continuity of policies and programs towards resilience building and sustainable development. This coming October, we will be playing host to the first Philippine Urban Forum with the theme, Transforming Our Cities and Building Resilient Communities. This is to encourage the participation and support of various urban sectors and shareholders to the policies, strategies, and programs contained in our Philippine New Urban Agenda. We are very grateful for our international development partners, such as the UN Habitat, for continually providing us invaluable support in the development of these policies, programs, and projects. However, our work has only begun. Our country is one of 3 countries that are consistently impacted by most extreme occurrences like affected by climate change. We are experiencing devastating effects of climate change with frequent and catastrophic typhoons that ravage our communities and set us back in our economic gains. In fact, more than 50% of our cities and municipalities are threatened by inundation and sea level rise. As such, we urge all nations to enhance the international cooperation and mobilize resources towards the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 and pursue policies and programs that support climate change, climate justice, and equity. Thank you, and we look forward to the success of this interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary. Thank you for those inspiring words and also for sharing your multi-pronged strategies around housing and urban renewal. Without further ado, let me now invite our Executive Director, Undersecretary General of the United Nations, Madam Maimouna Mohammed Sharif, to give some remarks. The ED is not a stranger to this audience or to this room, but let me just reveal a small story while introducing her. A few weeks before the Assembly, a couple of months before the Assembly, as we were having a conversation on the outcomes of the Assembly, she called me and she said, Shipra, that if there is one significant outcome of this Assembly, it must be on housing. And that is a testament to her commitment on housing and to this room that is here in attendance for this special session. Please, Edie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shipra. But I think she forgot to add another sentence. It said, that is your KPI. Housing must be one of the outcomes of the resolution. Your KPI must be, must be there to achieve here. Ministers, Excellencies, honorable guests and speakers, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be together with here. C.S. Zakaria is here from the Ministry of Housing and Infrastructure, Republic of Kenya. I have Mr. Henry Yap from Philippines. I have also my sister Amna. I just came back from Bahrain. And I really beautiful work that in Bahrain. I went before that is under construction. When I went for the second time, people is already moved into the housing scheme. And also have my friends all the way from Kitchener and also Richard, that is also our colleagues. So ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you today to this special sessions on housing within the second UN Habitat Assembly, focusing on realizing a sustainable urban future through inclusive and effective multilateralism. What I would like to share with you is that we would like to transform shelter, roof above the head, to a house, then from house to a home, and from home to a communities, and from communities to a livable cities and human settlement. That's the reason why UN Habitat put adequate housing, affordable and accessible housing as one of our priorities, and there is one resolution now being discussed by the member state on adequate housing. So I hope by Friday we will get that endorsed by the member states and during the assembly. Excellencies, friends, Since its foundation, UN Habitat has worked to promote access to adequate housing as one of the transformative forces that can lead the world to overcome challenges related to climate change, poverty, exclusion, and inequality. Adequate housing has shown its potential as an engine of inclusive and sustainable development with linkages to most of the other SDGs and beyond 4 walls and a roof. Adequate housing is a home that is secure and connected to services, employment opportunities, and urban life. Without a holistic consideration of the contribution of adequate housing to social protection and welfare system, crucial opportunities to meet social policy goals through housing program are lost. Safe, affordable, sustainable housing is a fundamental element of poverty reduction. By providing access to shelter, basic services, and urban opportunities at an affordable cost that does not compromise other fundamental needs, housing is key to build resilience to economic, social, health, and environmental shocks. Safe, well-located, and affordable housing allows people to access stable education, health and services, employment opportunities, public amenities, and green spaces. You have seen it in the presentation of Richard this morning, and which is turn increase well-being and reduce inequalities. Housing also plays a catalytic role in urban economic development and employment generation, as housing sector touches every single aspect of the economy of a country. Quality and sustainable housing is central in addressing climate change and reducing pollution. The building and the construction sector is responsible for nearly 40% of the global greenhouse gas emission and consume large shares of resources. So with the building stock set to double by 2050, emission, energy, and resource consumptions are set to increase unless we sensibly improve the sustainability of building materials, the design of households and of urban expansion, the way we consume energy, water, and manage waste. At the same time, it is critical to ensure that climate mitigation and adaptation are anchored in a strong human rights framework to avoid producing additional inequalities and loss of housing due to displacement, land grabbing, and lack of participation by affected communities. While the world continues to urbanize, the demand of adequate housing increases rapidly. Designing and building adequate housing means shaping inclusive and prosperous cities and communities. The spread of COVID-19 has demonstrated once again, and with undeniable strength, that adequate housing is the cornerstone of people's and communities' health, dignity, safety, inclusion, and well-being. As such, it needs to be equally fully recognized as a pillar of a new social contract based on the coordinated action of different stakeholders. The effort must be led by government interventions to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the fundamental right to adequate housing as a component of an adequate standard of living. While it is true that the COVID-19 pandemic and a relative disengagement from housing policies in the last decades have reversed many earlier gains, as indicated by the ongoing review of the SDG 11 to be presented at the High-Level Political Forum 2023 session next month. We must remain committed to addressing urban poverty, homelessness, slums, and inadequate housing. Current trends, including aging population, spreading of online platforms for short-term rentals, financialization and commodifications of housing, as well as the urgent need for a just and fair transition to energy efficiency and reduced emission, are increasingly calling for rethinking of the current system to strengthen coordination under the strategic leadership of governments. I sincerely thank all the distinguished speakers, distinguished guests who make a point to come here and listen to the program and to the event on housing, who will be contributing to this critical discussion today and provide example how advancing holistic and coordinated housing policies can shape inclusive and prosperous community. And we also would like to bring the outcome of this Habitat Assembly, especially on housing, to the high-level political forum, to the SDG Summit, to the Summit of the Future, to the Summit of the World Social Summit, and also all the other global platforms, not only to discuss, but we also need to come up with a plan. Because discussion without plan, without action, without financial, it also doesn't work. So we would like to look into this. How can we implement whatever that we discussed today with the clear work plan, with the clear areas of intervention, and with the clear policies and implementation. So together, we have the opportunity to create a better future where every individual has access to adequate, safe, affordable, and sustainable housing. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Edie. Thank you for your remarks, and thank you for your commitment. I do know that you need to leave for another meeting, but thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today. We will now move into a panel discussion. I believe we can go a little bit over our allocated time of 2:30. So we now have a panel of 4 eminent speakers. We have His Excellency Mr. Zakaria Njeru, the CS for Lands, the Cabinet Secretary for Lands, Housing and Urban Development in Kenya. We have Ms. Audrey Guiral-Naples, the Deputy Head of Development, Urban Development, Planning and Housing Division from AFD, the French Development Agency. Welcome. We have the Mayor of Kitchener, Canada, and co-president of UCLG, Mr. Barry Verbanovich. And we have Mr. Carlos Martinez Velasquez, Director General Infonavit from Mexico. Thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion. You've heard the keynote and you've heard the ministers. Perhaps we get into a bit of a conversation at this point. Let me start with you, Cabinet Secretary, if I may. We have heard His Excellency the President yesterday. We know the commitment of your government to the provision of adequate and affordable housing. How do you see this contributing to the economic growth and social development of Kenya and the welfare of Kenyan citizens? What are the key learnings from the implementation of this huge agenda that you might want to share with your peers and colleagues in the room today?
Thank you very much. I want to appreciate all of you as a host minister and welcome you to Kenya. And also on matters housing in Kenya, those who were there yesterday, the President really talked about it, and it's one of the key agendas of the government of Kenya. The urbanization in Kenya is very high. It's about 4.2%, and that means that in the next few years, we'll have many people living in the urban areas. As a result of this, as a result of that fast growth of urbanization, which is not matching well with the housing and other infrastructural developments within the urban areas, we have had a lot of sprawling of slums and informal settlement. And that's why the government has taken keen interest in making sure that provision of affordable housing is done. Currently, we have a deficit of 2 million units in Kenya, and this has been accelerated by the fact that housing in Kenya is a problem. Many Kenyans live, their earnings are below 20,000 Kenya shillings, and that makes it very hard for them either to rent or to get a mortgage for a house. So that's why there is that deliberate and intentional effort by the government to make sure that we build 200,000 units every year, which are affordable, are meant for the low cadre in the society. As a result of this, there will be job creation because we are not just looking at houses with the four walls and the roof. We are also looking at the impact these houses are going to bring to the society. We have come up with 69 standardized components that will be used in these houses, and as a result, the medium and the MSMEs have come together and have been doing a lot to make sure that they come up, they build, they manufacture those components. So as a result of these buildings, these houses, we will have job created, we will have businesses sprouting up, we will also have local materials being used. So to us, we are seeing a change in our economy and providing jobs to the millions of Kenyans who are creative and who are willing to work but lack such opportunities.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think putting housing not just as a roof, as a right, but also a sector of the economy and a mechanism to drive employment and the economy is an absolutely a fundamental element that I think many governments would identify with. May I turn now to you, Audrey, from the AFD, from your perspective, how do you see housing policies shaping inclusive and prosperous communities and cities? And as the Cabinet Secretary also just talked about, how does it contribute to larger socioeconomic objectives?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. We have something in common, everyone today in this room, is that we all have a house. And we know that outside, not only here, but in every country, it is not the case for everyone. And it is not the case even in France, where after 1 year of involvement in housing policies, we are still facing homelessness. And that's why we consider that the housing sector and housing policies is a very, very important subject, a key issue. That's why France was very pleased to support the Kenyan resolution on housing. And at AFD, we are also very happy because we have signed yesterday our first memorandum of understanding with UN Habitat in order to join forces on this subject. Let me tell you a few words about AFD and the housing sector. Just to tell you that we've been working on this subject for over 20 years, even over 30 or 40 years, because it is one of AFD's historic area of intervention. Over the past 10 years, we have supported 34 projects that represent over 2 billion euros. This is good, but obviously this is not enough regarding the needs. We are working with a wide range of partners, state, local authorities, housing banks, private and public developers. And for us, housing is an extremely important sector because we consider it as a cornerstone for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, not only the Goals 11, but many others, and that it has a key role to play in terms of reduction in inequality, as well as the low-carbon transition of territories. Just to highlight one subject about the link between housing and the development of sustainable cities that have been very well developed, just wanted to tell that at AFD, housing is a part of the sustainable housing strategy because we consider that it is absolutely necessary to consider housing production as a major component of urban planning and urban development. As you said, building housing is about building cities, and the production of housing must be considered with a conjunction of production of public facilities and infrastructures. And we know that it is not a simple issue because most of housing programs today are designed at the national level. Sometimes, while authorities are not competent or not involved in their definition. Or, in other cases, housing units are produced by the initiative and by opportunities by the private sector, which is good, but which in many cases doesn't involve local authority, and it is not linked to urban planning. That creates a huge problem in terms of sustainable cities. And you have shown it with your example of empty buildings just after being built. So that's one point that is very important for us. And you asked me about the social and economic impact, and I will focus maybe on the economic impact, just to share with you some figures, because according to a study recently realized by Habitat for Humanity, the housing sector represents between 8 and 18% of GDP, with an average on 13. For instance, in Morocco, the housing sector represents 15% of GDP and 1 million employees. Another example, we have made a study a few years ago in French overseas territories, which are small territories but with huge issue in terms of economic development. And according to this study, it is estimated that the construction of one housing unit creates 3 jobs. This figure highlights a strong link between housing supply and economic development at the national scale. But we know also that it is very hard to build affordable and sustainable housing units quickly and massively. But it is where, in our opinion, the public sector has a role to play. Because national programs, by giving visibility to the private sector in terms of public investment and financing, can play a key role to help structure and develop the construction sector. In France, we managed to do that in the 60s with a large public planification. It has not been a complete success in terms of urban development, but it has been decisive to structure the construction sector and make it able to respond to big production objectives. And last point, economic development of cities is directly linked to the capacity to offer housing units to their workers close to their jobs. In Europe, we have seen that historically, with the first initiative in terms of housing production came from private companies that needed to provide house to their workers as a condition to develop their activity. And today in France, private companies are still contributing to the financing of social housing through a dedicated fund. I will stop here, but please to continue.
Thank you very much, and thank you for flagging both the role of the private sector. We never think properly about the role of the private sector in providing affordable or social housing, but workers' housing is something absolutely central to that conversation. Thank you also for highlighting the question of competencies and the role of local authorities and how it relates to the role of national governments. Perhaps on that note, I turn to Mayor Barry Verbanovich, the mayor of Kitchener. Mayor, what is the role of cities in addressing housing challenges? Very often you don't have competencies in that area. How do you work in the framework of multi-level governance to advance the right to adequate housing in your city?
Well, thank you very much, Shifran, and Excellencies, Ministers, esteemed colleagues. It's an honor to join you today and bring both the perspective as co-president of United Cities and Local Governments, as the representative of the local and regional government constituency, as well as the Mayor of Kitchener, Canada, an intermediary city of about 270,000 people near Toronto. UCLG, as the voice of the world's local governments, is committed to ensuring that all populations have access to adequate housing as a right and necessary precondition for the fulfillment of other human rights and the right to the city. Ensuring access to adequate housing for all is also a catalyst for sustainable socioeconomic progress, ensuring that no place and no person is left behind. Housing is thus a central priority for local and regional governments, and as such, we're working at different levels and often in alliance with other orders of government and organized communities to advance the right to adequate housing and leverage its potential to transform societies. As reflected in the UCLG Pact for the Future, advancing housing systems capable of caring for their populations, particularly for those who are overlooked at present, that protect the common practices that sustain the social production of housing and that advance the human well-being of all. This work on housing as a human right, both at UCLG and amongst Canadian cities like Kitchener, has included working with Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. However, we cannot have this conversation today without acknowledging that events of recent years, specifically the COVID-19 pandemic, shed light on the inadequacy of current housing systems to protect populations around the world, aggravating the pace at which global progress on ensuring access to adequate housing is knocked off track. The number of people in informal settlements is growing, and the proportion of urban populations in inadequate housing is also increasing. This is also true in intermediary cities whose population growth is not being matched by infrastructures. In order to respond to these global dynamics, local and regional governments have been leveraging their global networks to jointly advocate for more capacities to respond to these challenges, as put forward in the 2018 Municipalist Declaration of Local Governments for the Right to Housing and the Right to the City. This has been true in both my own city, Kitchener, and my own country, Canada, and I want to acknowledge the Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the UN in Nairobi, who's here today, Robert Bunbury. This journey began before the pandemic, where working with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and Canadian Cities and Communities, our government approved its first ever national housing strategy in 2019. Shortly after that, Canada, like the rest of the world, saw the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on housing for the residents we serve. As a result of the realities of the economic impacts of COVID-19, Canada and its cities and communities have stepped up to tackle these challenges. From new funding programs introduced by our Canadian government, like the Rapid Housing Initiative, Phases 1, 2, and 3, and the $4 billion Housing Accelerator Fund, to new policy initiatives from cities to tackle issues like encampments and inclusionary zoning, the efforts by all orders of government, national, provincial, and territorial and local and regional governments, have put people at the forefront, working to ensure that housing is part of building cities and that nobody is left behind. In closing, achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and tackling the housing challenges of our planet requires localizing the housing agenda, acknowledging local and regional governments as political actors that beyond implementing national policy should have enough autonomy based on the principle of subsidiarity to design and implement local housing policy. Because in fact, with innovative and bold local actions, local and regional governments are not only implementing housing policies, but redefining what local housing policy entails, showcasing how it can be a lever for social inclusion and equitable human development, and for co-creating more just and sustainable futures. This needs a coordinated effort by all spheres of government, and in particular, we need national governments to pay closer attention to the needs of communities, regardless of administrative status, placing people at the center of urban policy making. We also need a multilateral system that has to be based on trust, peace, and sustainability from the bottom up, forming the base of a new social contract driven by local action, and guaranteeing local and regional governments and civil society are fully engaged by holding a permanent seat at decision-making tables. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very clear call for a stronger role for local and regional governments at all levels, including in the multilateral system. where these conversations are had and decisions are made. So thank you very much. Let me now turn to our last panelist, Mr. Carlos Martinez Velasquez, who's the Director General of Infonavit, the Institute of National Housing Fund for Workers in Mexico. Carlos, your institution has been described as the main Mexican state institution working for families to exercise their constitutional right to dignified and decent housing. This is a very tall order. This is a very huge ask. Tell us a little bit about how is housing being leveraged as an instrument contributing to poverty reduction, addressing inequalities, and advancing socioeconomic development.
Of course, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. And I want to talk about how home ownership and the actions we do in Infonavit can contribute to poverty reduction, because we think that housing policy it's linked with poverty in two folds. Poverty has a great impact on housing circumstances, and housing circumstances can have negative impact on poverty and other dimensions of well-being. On affordability affects disadvantaged social groups, many of whom find it difficult to afford a housing, even more so in areas close to jobs. So when affordable housing options are available, people can allocate a smaller portion of their income to housing costs. And this, a lower share, frees up resources from other essential needs such as education, healthcare, and food. So Infonavit is the biggest social housing funder in Mexico and provides sufficient funding for housing needs for all private sector workers. Infonavit attends 22 million people who are in private sector in Mexico, and actually the fund is from the 5% of national payroll, and with that funding we can create this credit system that is aimed to lend former workers home ownership, but also we offer credits aimed to facilitating home repairs, retrofitting, and expansions. And then, with these credits, we believe that we have incidence in providing adequate housing through cheaper and easily available credit. We can improve some poverty dimensions through its activity on housing mortgages, land mortgages, and home improvement credits. There are impacts on decreasing housing with inadequate quality or insufficient space, and decrease the lack of basic housing services. Actually, Infonavit is spending 1% of Mexican GDP each year in this credit program. I think it's one of the biggest credit programs around the world. And now, since 2020, we adopted the new urban agenda in all our credit programs. For example, since 2021, all loans from Infonavit are evaluated with urban criteria. So every house we finance must have all basic services like water and energy, and be placed in a neighborhood with primary schools, health facilities, public spaces, access to effective mobility solution, and in a radius of 2 kilometers. So every loan is evaluated with this criteria, so we can grant for all workers, especially low-income workers, that they are buying a good located home. Because in Mexico we have a paradox, because we have, of course, a housing deficit, but also we have now, right now, Infonavit have 615,000 units abandoned. Because that's a negative thing of sprawl urbanism, because many of these homes are built like 20 years ago and have no services, and people spend more of their income in water or transport than the mortgage payment. So they abandon the homes. So now we have the problem that we need to retrofit that homes, but actually to impulse new buildings around the country. So it's important to know that these panels, this kind of multilateral discussions can help us to understand each other, to listen each other, and of course not replicate the mistakes that we do in the past, and we can do something good for a better future.
Thank you very much. And learning from each other's mistakes is a very important part of this proposition. Indeed, if you've gone down that way before, we don't need to repeat, you know, the mistakes you've made or the experiences you've had which haven't worked. Thank you very much. I believe we are running out of time, so there will be no time to take questions. But I want to perhaps try and synthesize some of the key messages from the conversation today. First of all, the universality of the housing agenda. We've heard experiences from all continents today, and it's very clear that housing is an agenda, is an issue, is a challenge, is a priority in all parts of the world. As I said at the beginning, it manifests differently. But the fact is that there is no country that has really cracked it. There is no region that has cracked it. And it's very important to go as a collective looking for the right solutions. Second, and again repeating a little bit, but the lack of advancement globally on the right to adequate housing is a failure of markets as well as an abject failure of public policy. We have to acknowledge that before we move on to solutions. It's a failure of public policy at international, national, regional, local levels. And some things need to change in order to be able to transform from where we are today to where we want to go. We have at the same time heard some fantastic examples of approaches, multi-pronged approaches that work. Approaches that put cities at the center, that put housing at the core of city planning. You talked about the housing towns. Professor Burdett talked about housing being at the center of urban planning and design as a central element. We just talked about accessibility and connectivity being fundamental to housing units being used even after they are provided. We've heard about urban renewal and how that relates to the question of housing, provision of infrastructure. And we've heard of approaches that combine these to talk about renovation of existing housing stock with public-private partnerships to build more stock, with the work of a company like a state company like Infonavit to advance the access to housing, with improving access to loans at reduced rates, at affordable rates. And we've heard the question of multi-level governance, extremely important because no sphere of government can deliver adequate housing on its own. National governments need to set policy in consultation, in discussion with other spheres of government, with local government, as well as with other actors. Listening to stakeholders, listening to the private sector, understanding where the needs are, and also understanding where the opportunities are. I think these are the important and fundamental elements that we need to have at the center of any conversation on housing. We're very happy and very pleased to be able to advance this discussion today. We're very grateful for each one of you to have taken the time in this assembly when we know you have important intergovernmental business to address on the other side as well, to put this on your agendas, to talk about housing to us. We're very grateful that several countries, not just Kenya, France, Bahrain, but also several others have joined forces to co-sponsor the resolution on housing. And I hope that those and many others will be our partners in taking this resolution and what it offers forward. The central piece of this resolution is the establishment of a collaborative platform of an expert intergovernmental working group where governments can exchange their views, pool their expertise, reflect on the latest data, set strategy, talk about where changing course is required, harmonize standards, and ultimately develop more impactful housing policies, housing strategies, and action plans for all of us, for their own countries, but for all of us as a global community. Thank you very much once again, and thank you all for joining us today.